Good evening. Hello, welcome. So nice to have all of you here. It's nice to see so many new people. Because my glasses are too dirty to see through, so I'm not going to use them. It's really nice to be here with you all. My name is Matt Bell. I'm the director of the ASU World Building Initiative here at ASU. Obviously, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our second workshop of the fall of 2024 semester, Sci-Fi Economics, using speculative fiction to imagine alternative futures. Tonight, we'll have two presentations from members of our ASU community. After, so have time for conversation, for questions from all of you, whether you're with us here in person or joining us online. Before we begin, as always, I'd just like to thank our partners at ASU, including the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Department of English, the Virginia G. Piper Center for Creative Writing, and the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics, where the World Building Initiative is housed. Thanks especially to Karina Fitzgerald and Eliza Kent, my partners in the initiative, who do so much to make these events possible. If you are online, Karina's manning the chat, Eliza's manning the chat. When the time comes for questions, you can put those into the chat, and Eliza will read them into the room for us. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's world builders, J.M. Applegate, Andrew Dana Hudson. J.M. Applegate is research faculty at Arizona State University's School of Complex Adaptive Systems and co-lead of the Complexity Economics Lab. She holds graduate degrees in nuclear physics and applied mathematics. It's a cooler sentence than anyone's ever said about me. Pretty cool to be a nuclear physicist. She studies fundamental dynamics of economic systems, such as the differential effects of monetary flows within the economy, the coupling of wages and production, the evolution of housing stock, and the generative origins of economic development. She believes economies are emergent and adaptive structures arising from the interplay of material realities and social decisions, and in the importance of sustainable individual and collective agency. She's also an avid science and speculative fiction reader. Which is good, because we have a speculative fiction writer in the room as well. Andrew Dana Hudson is a speculative fiction writer, sustainability researcher, and futurist. He is the author of Our Shared Storm, a novel of 5 climate futures, as well as many short stories appearing in Slate, Future Tense, Lightspeed Magazine, Skate Pod, Grist, and more. His nonfiction has appeared in Slate, Jacobin, and his own newsletter, SolarShades.club. He has a master's degree in sustainability from Arizona State University, where he is now pursuing an MFA in creative writing. He's also an imaginary college fellow. Is that right? Imaginary college fellow? It doesn't sound right. Doesn't he go to imaginary college? We'll work that out. Yeah. Something similar to that. He's doing some imagining, I think is right. At the ASU Center for Science and the Imagination. He often teaches, lectures, and advises on climate fiction and solar punk, including at venues such as the Museum of the Future in Dubai, Republic in Berlin, and C2MTL in Montreal. Please join me in welcoming J.M. Applegate. We have first presenter. Yeah, see it.
Hi, my name is Jaffa Applegate, and I am delighted to be here. I am co-lead of the Complexity Economics Lab at the School of Complex Adaptive Systems here at ASU, and believe me, the economists at Deputy Carey don't think that what I do is economics. We're going to have some fun anyway. Okay, so over the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to make the case that economics is world building, and that when you practice economics, you are actually engaging in the art of world building. I'm going to make this case with 3 foundational points about economies, and these points might require us to think about economics in ways we're not quite used to. So the first point is what I mean by economics, or an economy as a thing that we talk about. So what is it that economists study? So I'm going to describe an economy is the rules and the institutions and norms that govern social production. So let me be clear what I mean by that, and more importantly, what I don't mean by that. So a feral child living in the woods is going to learn not to eat all the honey out of the hive. She's going to understand that you save some for the bees. Now, that being said, it's also highly unlikely that an individual will eat all the honey out of the hives because they have this ingrained satiation, right? So a neoclassical economist would say, well, at some point, the utility of further consumption basically falls off or it becomes zero. But the important point is that while this child is deeply engaged with the natural environment and using resources, they are not producing socially. They're not being produced. They're certainly not producing socially. So therefore, I would say that their activity and their relationship with those resources would not be described as economic. Now, neoclassical economics focuses on the most efficient allocation of resources. But economics isn't so much about resources, whether they're scarce, whether it's an artificial scarcity, whether they're made scarce, or whatever. Because resource allocation is secondary to the primary dynamic at play, which is that of social production. So social production is also embedded in the natural world and thus subject to ecological constraints and dynamics. But with social production comes something really unique to humans. And this is the return to cooperative labor, which creates a surplus compared when people are producing individually. For example, if I make a widget and you make a widget and we're working in parallel, which means we're each making the widget from end to end on our own, we may, in an hour, let's say we produce 2 widgets. Now let's say what we're going to do is we're going to work in series. So we're not going to work in parallel, we're going to work together to produce each widget. Well, what might happen is I'll make part of the widget, you might make the other part of the widget, and at the end of the hour, you might end up with 3 widgets. This third widget, this is a surplus, this is a return, this is a bonus. It's really important to understand that this quality of human beings working together to produce cooperatively, it's a kind of magic. So what are the consequences of this magic? Well, if you only need 2 widgets and we can make the widgets in less than an hour, then we have to do that. Or maybe we're selling these widgets, so we go ahead and we make 3 widgets, and for the same amount of time, we increase our revenue. Or maybe because we can make 2 widgets, or 3 widgets, or 2 widgets in less amount of time, maybe we could reduce the price of widgets. So these are all possibilities centered around what we as a society decide to do with those magical returns to production. Other consequences of the returns to cooperative production arise out of the ease with which we can overproduce. This is where we come up against those natural and resource constraints that we had talked about before, and which neoclassical economists tend to focus on. Okay, this has been an issue throughout history. So, for example, it's famously understood that in the last millennium before Christ, you had basically deforestation of the Fertile Crescent. So where Syria and Iraq used to be verdant, forest-filled regions, they are now became deserts. Well, that's something that happened. That's something that people did through this tendency to overproduce. It's also important to remember that this idea of the division of labor and these returns of the division of labor were well understood way before Adam Smith started talking about thin factories. But it's also important to understand that this propensity to overproduce really went into overdrive once we hit the Industrial Revolution. So there's some couple things that really were important to happen here. With the start of the Industrial Revolution, what we ended up having was tools that enable people who were doing different parts within the division of labor to do their work much more quickly and much more efficiently. So speedily, we could create a whole bunch of stuff. Now, if you actually roll this forward and imagine you're going to take that division of labor, you're going to keep dividing it into more and more parts, well, then those parts become simple instructions, and all of a sudden, not only do you have tools that are helping people in their human task of performing an activity to make a widget, you can actually automate the entire widget making process. So again, the question is overproduction. We can produce a ton of stuff. Okay, why is this important? Because there's a flip side to this. So once you can create all of this stuff, you end up making much more stuff than people imagined that they could ever possibly use. So now you have to generate a market and a demand for all that stuff that you've made. Okay, so now you've got geopolitics and you've got advertising. So the geopolitics is opening up markets globally so that you have more consumers for the stuff you're producing, and you also have to hire them in factories so they have wages so they can become consumers. And the other flip side is that you have advertising, I'm sure we're all very well aware. This is a very complex psychological understanding of how to tweak desire in all of us so that all of a sudden you really need that Stanley insulin cup. Okay. Right, and the other aspect that comes out of this is not just the advertising, but just this need to constantly produce, the need to create demand leads to this tendency we have for what's called planned obsolescence, which means that goods are produced that are going to fail really quickly so that they can produce a new one and then you have to buy a new one. So this is all consequences of the magical returns to production, the way that our society has decided to set up the rules and the institutions around that production for those returns. And I'm sure we all have experience having to replace a consumer good within a year. But we are currently in the self-reinforcing loop of generating demand and overproducing for that demand. And it's all powered by our current profit growth paradigm. We'll come back to this point. So personally, I think a ban on advertising would be the most effective way to reduce not only production, not only consumption, but would also reduce production. Okay, but then none of this would be a thing, again, if it wasn't for that magic return to cooperative production. So that's the first point I wanted to make, which is that economics in essence, this is in essence about managing social production. The second point I want to make is that economic structures are socially determined and reflect prevailing beliefs and values. Okay, so I'm going to go into two examples here. One is real world and one is fictional. The Order of Saint Benedict, or the Benedictines, operate monasteries throughout the world, and they can be considered economic microcosms. Okay, the Benedictines believe that in order to have spiritual balance, you have to both pray and work. By doing work, you are becoming closer to God, and also the result and product of that work belongs to God. Okay, so monasteries support themselves through various activities, including professional activity. You can have lawyer monks that go off and provide legal services, they do agriculture, they do crafts, and they get paid. But all of the revenues go into a common fund that is managed by the monastery, so no monk gets a private income. Not only do they not get a private income, they also don't own property. So I'll come back to that in a minute, because what's also important is that it is the community as a whole that decides what to do with all of that revenue that comes through. And part of that typically goes to providing monks' annual stipends. Okay, but it's important to go back to this idea about the fact that they don't have any private property, because property and ownership, what can be owned and how it can be owned, is central to economic systems. So, for example, there's a question: who owns the cooperative production surplus? So specifically in our case, who gets the benefit of the bonus widget? So capitalists will say it belongs to the individuals who had the money that were able to organize the production. Marxists will tell you, well, it belongs to the workers. Benedictines will tell you, well, it belongs to God, and the monastery is simply the steward of those funds. But you see that we have three different value and belief sets, which lead to three different economic scenarios, different economic arrangements. Okay, and again, just the point is that all of this ownership and this whole structure is determined by the values and beliefs by the people who are actually putting the rules and institutions in place. Okay, my second example. So fictional book. All right, so this is Ecotopia, written by Ernest Callenbeck. All right, so here in this story, you have a reporter that has come to tour and be a tourist in Ecotopia, which is, I think, Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. They've seceded from the US, and as the name might imply, because they're called Ecotopia, they have very strong environmental and sustainability values. All right, so here's some things that you can do. You cannot produce, well, here's some things you can't do. You cannot produce anything, you cannot make anything that is not imminently biodegradable. So it's not like it's still biodegradable in 100 years. I mean, it has to be that if you left it alone for a week in a field, it would be gone, right? So that's the first rule that they have. Any production is regulated to conform to what they call the state environment with the state within the environment. So it has to be basically zero impact. I mean, overall impact on the environment. Okay, taxes on production allow for a version of universal basic income. Overproduction is discouraged and advertising is minimal and permitted in very specific times and locales. Basically, there's 1 hour every night where the TV allows everybody to advertise. And some people ignore it and some people say, oh, let's see what most people are doing now. Okay, within these regulatory confines, there's a great deal of personal liberty and freedom because this is important to people as well. There's copious free time, no sense of urgency with anything having to do with work. People lead a rich cultural and social lives that don't include shopping, and services such as education of children, they're offered as independent and distributed services. Okay, granted, the story also includes weirdness around sex, violence, and race, but we're not going to talk about that right now. But in both cases, you can see how the values, beliefs within a community are used to put together the rules in the institutions that actually say how they produce together and how they distribute the goods and services that they have produced. Okay. We're going to go a little bit later into our modern economic beliefs and values, or what the modern beliefs and values might be that inform our own economic rules and institutions. But before we go there, I've got one more thing to say about neoclassical economics. So I think the trouble in neoclassical economics is not so much this misunderstanding in the relative importance between focusing on resource allocation and focusing on returns to production. What's more important is that they have forgotten that economies are socially constructed. Okay, there is no such thing as an economic law. Okay, there are simple social propensities that people have depending on given situations. And it used to be, everybody up through Smith, they weren't even economists, they called themselves political philosophers, right? So and then about 100 years ago, we had some engineers and some physicists that decided that they were going to start using their tools and methods to answer economic questions. And then people got really excited about this because now they're scientists and they're not philosophers, and that came with a great deal of social cachet. And then things just really got away. Okay, my third point is that a society needs to maintain these economic structures, and they stabilize these beliefs and values, and they do so through narratives. See how this is all tying together with writing. All right. So again, I'm going to provide 2 illustrations of this point. I think we're all very familiar that many indigenous American cultures demonstrate values having to do both with reciprocity with the environment as well as communal living. These usually stem from beliefs in the kin-like relationship between humans, animals, and plants, and the natural world in general. So the Algonquins have a mythical character known as the Wendigo. It's a ragged, somewhat skeletal, fierce-looking creature who actually eats people. But the Wendigo personifies greed, gluttony, and excess. In this folklore, people who are governed by the spirit of selfishness get turned into cannibals. All right, so stories of the Wendigo are used to teach children to control their appetites and to think and behave altruistically. They are also used to describe the white man's profit-maximizing production and consumerism. The second example I'd like to give with regard to the importance of narrative has to do with our own U.S. economy. So Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway recently published a book called The Big Myth. And in this book, they describe in excruciating detail this, it's not really an event, it's an ongoing activity of a cadre of people who work together over time. The group of people evolved, the organizations they were working in evolved. But these people worked very hard and very diligently and very intentfully to develop this narrative and put it into our cultural understanding. They used radio programming, they used comic strips, they used movies, they did novels, they infiltrated and did publishing with academics, and they also influenced sermons. So they were very effective at going and getting into the kind of the cultural mythology of the United States, some ideas that we would call today as having to do with free market fundamentalism. So one of their tools was something called the tripod of freedom. The tripod of freedom was democracy, the Bill of Rights, and free enterprise. So this is an image from Life magazine, April of 1950. This is an ad. So this was the National Association of Manufacturers, which is one of these organizations that was involved in this effort. So they put out some very interesting, actually this one's called Electric Light and Power Companies. So it's a little bit complicated, okay? But most of this effort was coming from the National Association of Manufacturers. So it's a bunch of organizations involved. Now, when they say Bill of Rights, what they're specifically referring to is the ability to own property as well as freedom of religion. So I don't know if you can see this in the back. The question is, will you leave these to your children? Men have died to leave you these 4 symbols of freedom: a door key, a holy Bible, a pencil with which to be able to write whatever you wanted to write, expression of speech, and a free ballot. Okay, this group of people also brought Frederick Hayek to the US and installed him at the University of Chicago. They also funded Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago, and they also funded and got Rand Post. So anybody who has any question about whether or not narratives are important in producing values and beliefs that underpin economic decisions, all you need to do is remember the timelessness, the enduring nature of the cultish books and Atlas Shrugged. Okay. And this narrative is still really strongly at play today, or at least last Friday. Okay, so I'm going to conclude with Alex Karp, quote from Alex Karp. Alex Karp is the CEO of Palantir. So Palantir is that mysterious company that takes your data and turns it into targeted drone strikes and targeted marketing campaigns. Okay, so he is describing to Bill, this is on Real-Time Bill Maher just last Friday, so September 3rd. So he is explaining to Bill Maher why it is that he and Elon Musk have decided to leave woke California and move to Texas, where they have much less stringent tax regimes. So here's what he has to say. But you have to have rigorous thought, meritocracy, truth to build these companies. That's what we've been fighting to preserve, because if you want to have Palantir or SpaceX or whatever you're going to build, you have to have a system where people can build things, it's rigorous, they keep the value of what they built and share it with society. Okay, so I'm going to briefly attempt to unpack and parse this into beliefs and values. So obviously meritocracy is a core value, exemplified by rigorous thought and truth. There's also the belief that in order for people to invent and produce things, they have to be well compensated. Also, that society values Palantir and SpaceX because they represent technological progress, and that's all good, right? And then it also makes some people very rich, and that's good, right? So I'll leave you with the question of what he means when he says, keep the value of what they build. So if world building is the deliberate creation of worlds, then this cadre described in the big myth indeed engaged in building a world based on a specific set of belief and values, which in turn actually manifested in a set of rules and institutions that govern our economy today. And they did it through narratives. So other narratives are not only possible, but urgently required. And now I'm going to turn this over to Andrew, so he can address how you might go about producing these desperately needed alternative economic narratives. Thank you. Move forward.
Hey. Well, thank you, Chapa. That was so great. And thank you for being here. Thank you, Matt, for bringing us here. And it's lovely to be in the Paper House as always. And this is such a cool initiative. I'm super honored to be be a part of it. And there's me again. There's where you can find some of my stuff. So, and yeah, Matt said I'm Andrew Dana Hudson, and here's the sort of one. Oh, there we go. Sorry, spoilers. Obligatory book slide.
Yeah.
Okay, for you to look at for a minute while and ponder your future purchases.
Quite the economic narrative.
While I start us off. So, Java made this case that world building in economics, right? That we have to sort of engage in active building of worlds if we're going to do economics in a better, different, more fulfilling, more equitable way. And for understanding that we can design our economy in lots of ways with lots of outcomes. And since I assume that at least maybe like half of you here are here because you're interested in like the creative craft of world building, I think that's sort of like kind of part of the demographic of this initiative. I'm going to go in the other direction and make the case that we should think about economics when we build imaginary worlds. So maybe it's obvious that you would be like, oh, and the economy is like this when you build a world. But I think the truth is that a lot of our most beloved and richly detailed worlds are kind of like thin on the economic details, right? Traveling across Middle Earth is supposed to be this like incredibly fraught and perilous journey. So much so that we have got like all these books about the months it takes to get anywhere, and you've got to fight the spiders and the dragons and the trolls. And yet clearly there must be sophisticated trade networks to give the hobbits all their stuff, all their consumer goods and lifestyle commodities, right? The British had a really well-developed empire by the time they had this kind of level of interior decor. If this is kind of what we're looking at, the hobbits must have sort of similarly access to that kind of thing. So, and the pipeweed and the silverware and the pine and rugs and so on, right? It's not just coming on the back of Gandalf's wagon, right? So, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, Tolkien doesn't go into all of that in great depth for us. Nor do we much discuss the financial costs of raising the 9 ghost armies to defend Rohan and Gondor, nor do we find out what it does to inflation in Lake Town when a dragon's horde is dumped into the local economy. For Star Trek, I watched a lot of Star Trek, but I could not really tell you how their economy works. They move beyond money, and that's really great. But what alternative mechanisms do they use to distribute resources and talent? They occasionally mention using something called credits. It's sort of a pet peeve of mine when futuristic worlds describe their money as credits, to indicate that it's sort of futuristic, of course, and also digital and universal. And in doing so, they erase exactly the kind of nuance that we have to spend all day navigating, right? Like exchange rates and interest rates and cashback incentives on our credit cards and cryptocurrency rug pulls and all these sorts of things. It's the equivalent of like reducing all social media to the feed, when in fact people spend a lot of time and effort parsing the differences between an Instagram post and a TikTok video and a Reddit question and a blue sky meme, all of this, right? So how are our Federation credits distributed, and what can they be used for? What's a Starfleet officer's average credit salary, and what does that buy in terms of like Romulan ale and alien archaeological artifacts that Picard really likes, and tribbles? We actually do know with tribbles. It's 10 credits for a tribble. We have that demo. At least in Kirk's day. So maybe there's been credit inflation. So they're always doing trade deals in Star Trek, right? But it's always a little unclear if those involve currency or kind of like space barter, where it's like you take 100 tons of tritium and I get 100 tons of deridium, or whatever sort of magical metals and crystals are. And, you know, what happens if like your tritium mine is destroyed by the Borg and you can't meet your end of the deal with the Cardassians? Are there financial instruments to smooth over that type of situation? Are there future insurance policies and so on? And I can tell you so much about the intricacies of various, extraterrestrial species military ranking systems, much more than I can about these sort of economic questions of the Federation. And okay, that is not to poke holes in these worlds. It would be a very different book if Tolkien had spent a lot of time talking about dwarven ranking practices, right? And arguably a worse, less mythopoetically resonant book, or at least one that appeals to different sensibilities. We all remember, right, the disaster of Jedi, police, trade negotiations, and Phantom Menace. You could also argue that Star Trek, this sort of futuristic utopian world, shouldn't lay out a blueprint for us, but should inspire us to adopt certain values, diversity and equality and freedom and peace. And of course, the caveat here is that if you dig really deep into the more greedily and deep, you will find hints at some of this stuff. And fans and writers will go through and create guides and wikis that fill in the gaps that have been left by Tolkien's books or smooth over the contradiction between different Star Trek series and episodes. But I do think that when you gloss over economic questions, you miss world building opportunities. So the routes that that commodities take, from raw materials to manufacturing to consumption and beyond, waste and so forth, right? What we do with that, that's all, I think, fascinating stuff. And it can be fascinating even in a world that's not as high-tech and globalized as ours. And if you're writing a world that's more high-tech and globalized, it'll be more fascinating. If you pick a good or commodity or magic sword or something and figure out where those activities of extraction, manufacturing, consumption, waste happen, that's like 3 or 4 potential spots to name on your secondary world fantasy map, right? So just right off the bat, you should just do that as a way to do your world building, to fill in the spots. And then there's questions of culture, right? The way debts are tracked and collected and maybe forgiven. This is an internally contested part of politics. And the division of labor, the composition of economic classes, this goes on to determine so much about our societies, from everything of how we wage war to how we, to what our fashion looks like. And more importantly, these world building opportunities are often ones that speak the most to our own situation as contemporary human beings. There's a line that I'm really fond of from the prominent 20th century literary critic Lionel Trilling, which says, literature is the human activity that takes the fullest and most precise account of variousness, possibility, complexity, and difficulty. So I always use this to explain why us writers are doing such an important job in the world. But a lot of the variousness, possibility, complexity, and difficulty that we experience flows from our relationship to economic systems, to the rules and entities that structure ownership and production, distribution, consumption, and labor. And maybe we don't like that fact, and we want to escape from it by delving into a good piece of escapist media. But it's unfortunately true. We live enmeshed in these enormous flows of capital, people, money, and goods. And many of these flows are getting more various, complex, and difficult as time goes on. At least some of the imaginary worlds that we build and the stories we tell should speak to that reality and help us make sense of it. That's my opinion. And we can do this while still including a lot of what is fun about fantastical worlds. Cool creatures and spaceships and magic systems, landscapes, and weird cultures and all sorts of things, right? So how Bacigalupi's recent secondary world fantasy novel, Novella, opens by talking about a magical, fossilized, evil, crystallized dragon eye. But it ends up getting you thinking a lot about banking and early Renaissance mercantile economies. Or in like these ancillary justice series features sentient spaceships crewed by cyber-possessed corpses, but also explores the commodity fetishism and exploitation that lies at the heart of imperialism. And there's so many examples of great science fiction, fantasy, and speculative fiction of all sorts doing this. And in fact, the scale and strangeness of things like multinational corporations, Wall Street banks, supply chains, Federal Reserve, right? They may require fantastical speculative metaphors to accurately describe, right? When we are making sense of these fickle economic gods and eldritch monsters, I find that speculative fiction is often more realistic than realist fiction. Just gonna throw that little cross genre line here. That's what the Pirate House is for. Okay, so this is a slide that the incredible diagram that Jaffa has prepared and let me use in my talk instead of in her talk. So to reconnect to what Jaffa was saying, right, here's this diagram of economic choices that you have when you are doing world building. Who owns resources and who gets to use them? Who owns the factories? Who makes the decision about production? How are surpluses that we talk about created distributed? Or who gets them, right? How are goods physically distributed in terms of transportation and warehouses and all those networks then go on to produce value or have costs too. How are goods allocated by markets, by gift economies, by ownership shares, by the state? All of these questions are choices, and all of these choices are great jumping off points for deepening your world building, or even for whole stories or narratives. And when we engage our imagination with these choices in mind, it helps us see that our own economic system is not natural or inevitable or set in stone. We could collectively renegotiate any of these or all of these decisions, as people often have done throughout history. And in the process, we could build a very different world. Imagining those alternate futures present and presents to build on different choices. That for me is just as exciting as imagining worlds in which we settle other planets, or summon demons, or ride giant birds, or catch Pokemon, or what have you. So here we'll get into like the craft portion of this. So a few strategies I've found for world building around alternative economies that hopefully will be useful to people, or world building in ways that speak to our experience with economic forces. So strategy number one, jobs. Just like start with jobs. What is an interesting job a person might have in your world or future that's unique to that world, that could reveal aspects of how that world works? What are skills that job requires? Are they manual skills, technical skills, people skills? How does a person develop those skills? Meaning, are there schools? Are there apprenticeship programs? Do they have to sort of take a placement exam? What kind of institutions surround that job? What are the benefits and perks and downsides? What does it feel like to do that job on a good day? What does it feel like to do that job on a bad day? You can get a lot of world building done out of answering those kinds of questions. And you can create characters who feel unique, who have unique goals and unique challenges. I am kind of very tired of fantasy series in which you never meet anyone who isn't a knight, a thief, a wizard, or some kind of bow class. Sci-fi stories where everyone is a soldier, a scientist, or a spaceship captain. Especially when the scientists aren't doing science as it happens and exists in the real world, of all sort of crunchy Maturian banality. from literary stories about creative writing professors in Brooklyn, creative writing professors in Maine, or creative writing professors convalescing in the French countryside, or anywhere in that range. Or all those romances that are not workplace romances, and so they're very vague on the details of what these characters do between their steamy encounters. Right, they're an architect often, or they're in marketing, or they just don't need a job at all. They're just sort of like purely vibing off bourgeois investments. I would much rather have stories of factory workers and teamsters, sewists and farm laborers and grocery clerks, dental hygienists, kindergarten teachers, EPA bureaucrats, and union organizers, so on and so on. And that's like why we love The Bear, right? Not just because it's like a good show, but because it wasn't another show about lawyers and detectives. It showed us a different world. And there's plenty of great fiction and world building out there that addresses job questions, right? Like I'm very fond of cyberpunk, and cyberpunk is full of people with jobs, right? A lot of the time there's market jobs, the hackers and the street samurai, right? But people have jobs, people are making a living. But even then, those archetypes zero in on people who get to be cool. And that is not so different from sort of the aforementioned romance novels about architects who, forget what they're actually doing 40 hours a week, right? What really matters is the love triangle with the hunky bartender and the cozy lakeside resort owner or whatever, right? Other cool people. I think as we have all discovered by living through our present day cyberpunk dystopia, not everyone gets to be cool, right? So raise your hand if you are or plan to be a hacker. Right? We got one. How about a merc? Corporate drone? Yeah. Okay, now hands are going up, right? That is much more our reality. Most of us don't get to be cyberpunks. Most of us get to be cyber pros, working and living under the boot heel of the platforms, the algorithms, the megacorps. So tell me some stories about what those jobs are like, what those lives are like, how we make meaning, how we live and die and resist. It's the job of writers and other world builders to make even the uncool jobs compelling, to use them to help us better see ourselves and our world and the systems of power that surround us. And when you take this task seriously, you realize a really fundamental truth is that there do not need to be shit jobs. Any job can be a good job if the compensation is right, if the working conditions are made safe, if the hours are humane, if the work is meaningful and useful, if workers have power and self-determination. It's a choice we make that some people deserve good jobs and some people don't. That some deserve to earn wealth from their work and some deserve to stay poor even though they work. Reimagining that choice, I think, would be a really powerful act of world building. That's snaps. So that was more of a rant than a strategy in the end. So let's move right along to strategy number 2, invent, remove, sustain. When describing a future world or an alternate world in time, I always try to regularly include a new novel thing that has appeared, like an institution, a concept, a cultural practice, an old thing that has failed or been lost or never existed. Somehow we can kind of tell that it's absent, and a familiar thing that is still going strong. So in Star Trek, we have gained warp speed, we have given up money, and we have sustained drinking on at the bar. And in Lord of the Rings, orcs exist. FX is the bear, so it's nice. But we can still drink alone at the bar. So really, if you maintain drinking alone at the bar, you're golden on that aspect. So invent, remove, sustain. If it helps, you could think of the Hindu trinity or Trimurti of Brahma the creator, Shiva the destroyer, Vishnu the preserver. Not to be confused with the three horsemen of world building. Wouldn't that be cool? Wouldn't that be fucked up? Wouldn't that be kind of hot? So no, invent, remove, sustain. This is a strategy for creating shock of the new and comforting verisimilitude at the same time. And with that dissonance between those two feelings, you trick the imagination into believing another world is possible. It's a way to make your world feel not static, but a part of an unfolding process of social change. Okay, strategy number 3, almost done. Scenarios. We talked a lot about how the economy is a design choice. Every choice implies an alternate world in which a different choice was made. And so that creates a sort of 2 different scenarios, right? Nothing wrong with the story that's sort of what ifs about that. But world building, I think, kind of goes beyond that usually, right? Now, 2 choices. You've got 2 choices. Now you've got 4 combinations. And that implies a whole possibility space, or what futurists call scenarios quadrant. So I work with these a lot. You pick 2 variables and imagine the diverging worlds created by going one way on one variable and or the other, and one way or another on the other variable. And they sort of look a little bit like the classic political compass, right? But you can use them for all sorts of things. Here are some of the variables that we use in a couple of energy futures projects I've worked on. One here at ASU, one in Luleå, Sweden. From these, we imagine different worlds based on how energy system was sort of being deployed, and wrote stories to bring those worlds to life. Got really good illustrations on the Swedish ones. Or here are the climate scenarios used by the IPCC called the shared socioeconomic pathways. And I turned these into my book, Our Shared Storm. There we go. Our Shared Storm. So the advantage of scenarios is that it isn't a one-dimensional spectrum between utopia and dystopia. Instead, scenarios imply trade-offs, priorities, winners and losers, philosophical disagreements and preferences that might vary for completely legitimate reasons. Not, did we make a good world? Did we make a bad world? But rather, which world would you like to live in? So, as you were thinking and about imagining and designing alternate economies, which I hope you are, take my advice. The world building will be so much richer and more useful if you give yourself several scenarios to play with. The more utopian your vision, the more this is true. This is because of what I call the reverse Anna Karenina principle. So, of course, the famous line from Tolstoy's novel Anna Karenina, the opening line is, happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. But with worlds, it is the opposite. All dystopias are kind of the same. My friend Madeline Ashby, the writer novelist, she says a jackboot is a jackboot is a jackboot. Dystopias are all about poverty and oppression and death. But utopias can be utopian in completely contradictory ways. And so if we want to imagine or even reach for something more utopian, we need to be willing to think and write and talk about what kinds of worlds we might build, what the pros and cons of those would entail, and which ones we would like to live in. Hopefully, if we do this enough, we can start to come to agreements between each other and hash out compromises. We can organize together around those visions, because the page is the only place where a person can build an entire world on their own. Everywhere else, we have to do it together. So, thank you.
Thank you both so much. It's really, really fantastic. It's such a pleasure to hear both of you speak. I'm really glad to hear it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I know this way to different people online too. I know I'm very loud. In this time, I want to let the audience ask questions. So I'll just ask 2 kind of quickly. One is thinking about like how we bring like the speculative thinking we're doing into the world, or where that sort of happens, where you've seen that sort of happen. I'm thinking a little bit about Jaffa's ending quote from the guy from Palantir. I think about Palantir all the time, partly because of his name, right? Like the Palantir is the thing in Lord of the Rings that Sauron like surveils everybody with. Like, and there's all these guys who are just naming their pet companies after like an evil thing from a book, and then doing that evil in the world, which seems crazy. Right, yeah, but like, I guess you need to explain what you're up to, but in like a funding meeting, right? But it seems like there's less of like the opposite, where like, oh, this really wonderful thing from a solar collector, let's name that and start a company, right? Like the speculative, like only the things from the dystopias are being made. And I just, that's probably not exactly true. I'm wondering if there's like an example you have of where a speculative economic thing or a speculative economic tool has like come into the world from like a movie or film or writing. Because we all agree that it's important to do this. I'm putting you on the spot. Try.
I'm thinking.
Yeah. Or even when you'd like. Yeah.
Well, one thing I'll say is we've got a lot, like a serious period of, we spent a long time using fiction to design economies that we didn't want to live in. And it's only kind of recently that we've really put our nose to the grindstone going the other way. So we're still in the process of like flooding the zone and letting that play out, right? I mean, it's like a 40-year time, you know, like lapse between sort of cyberpunk designing like cyberspace and so forth, and us getting, you know, our current like giant evil megacorps, right? So I think, you know, give us a little time, and, and hopefully we'll see it. One experience that I've had though is just talking to people about solar punk, which, you know, I didn't mention, but I was a kind of like successor to cyberpunk in some ways, like has these utopian tendencies. I find that there are people who like encounter those narratives and then are like, you know what, I could build like Arduino enabled hydroponics and I can quit my job and I can do this. And once people have the idea of using technology in ways that are not just for, you know, they're not determined by whether or not it turns a profit, people come up with a lot of creative, interesting things. I don't know. Could you come up with an example of how you solve?
No, actually, I have a disagreement.
Yeah.
So in 1888, Edward Bellamy wrote a book called Looking Backwards, where he imagines what the world would be like if everybody wasn't working for the profit of private ownership, but basically everybody was working for the community. Everything was community owned. This is 1888. I mean, communism hadn't happened yet, right? So I don't think it's been that it hasn't been out there for a while. Because certainly, Looking Backwards still has a cult following. And certainly, Ecotopia had a couple of books written afterwards about how we actually make this happen and things like that. I just really feel like there's prevailing headwinds with the strength of the big myth narrative. It's hard to move forward. We also have scaling issues. We have problems in this country. I don't know about collective decision making. So there's a lot of impediments. I am a huge fan of this, where I do agree with Andrew very strongly. I am a huge fan of solarpunk because it is so fundamentally optimistic, and it's also about scale. So I think there's some very interesting things coming out of there. It's not so much literature, it's more, I guess you'd say, short stories, art. I mean, solarpunk is much more exists, I think, in the artistic realm, where you have, you know, cities where there's plants everywhere, and it's much more technology focused. When you're talking about Arduinos and hydroponics, so it's very actionable in a way at a small level. So then the question is, one of the complaints I always make is that we want to talk about technology, but we don't want to talk about our social technology. What are our collective decision-making processes? Because frankly, winner takes all elections is pretty, it's pretty archaic.
Yeah, it makes you think of Marco Older's Infomocracy novels, which I've just been thinking about a lot while we're talking as like an example of like how to you know, one way of thinking about that. I think in the interest of time, we should open up to the audience. So people have questions you'd like to ask? Yeah, please in the back. Nice and loud.
Yeah, Yeah, thank you so much for the stimulating discussion. And I have many questions, so it's really hard to pick one. But I guess I think we were talking about sort of the narratives, the myths we tell ourselves about these social structures in economics. I just wondered that, it strikes me as I'm a Canadian, so I'm somewhat of an outsider to the US, I guess, but it strikes me that there's this idea of the American dream as a guiding ethos of social advancement, where someone can pursue this profit-making course and kind of give to the society in this massive fundamental way. And I feel like it's reinforced in so many dimensions of American life. And it sort of goes almost unchallenged. Mm-hmm. But in my perception, it actually also reinforces the American nightmare, which is of controlled wealth in a small few hands and these powerful corporations. So I guess my question is like that there's this founding mythology to the US and the economic system, and any challenges are sort of seen as maybe unpatriotic, or you get othered as a socialist, which here just seems to mean like communist straight up, which is completely not true, right? Like there's so many degrees of it. So how does one go about challenging the national ethos of the American dream into something that's a better dream, And
Have an idea.
Thank you.
You guys need to write something that replaces Atlas Shrugged.
Yeah.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Something that replaces Atlas Shrugged.
Okay.
Right?
Yes.
Okay, that's the challenge, right? Because this is what's so important about the narrative. The narratives that we share, the myths that we share, these are what embed beliefs and values, right? So if you want to shift the beliefs and values, you got to use your imagination. And I still believe that, I don't know if it's gaming or movies or novels or radio shows or comics or sermons, right? I mean, one of the things I didn't mention was that this cadre of people, they actually did writing contests for pastors in the Midwest to write on the tripod freedom. So anybody who's confused about how free market fundamentalism got tied up with Christian fundamentalism, it was intentional. So really intention. Do the work, intention. You've got so many allies and support people who you've got ideas for alternative economies. So you just have to replace it with something else. People are fickle. No.
I'll also say that when I was in high school, I entered a writing contest for a scholarship where I had to write an essay about Atlas Shrugged, and I didn't understand the book or why I was writing it. There were a lot of libertarian organizations where I grew up. Yeah. Yes. Other questions? Yeah, please.
How do you think that could you break, like if you look series now or movies, they all talk about like dystopian scenarios. The most famous series, like dark futures and everything. How can you break that? And because people love that as well, right? So how can you?
So just for people online, the question is like, how can we break like the whole like the dystopian future has like on our imagination? Like we've designed all of these dystopias and very few utopias.
Yeah, I ponder this a lot, and this has been like an active question since solar pump people started talking about it like back in 2014, which was actually, I think, that was the high watermark of the dystopia in pop culture. Mm-hmm. And I think since then, we've actually come down a lot, and we have a lot more narratives that are more optimistic or more generative or more sort of like challenging the inevitability of decline or catastrophe. They're just sort of, it takes a long time to like greenlight a movie and like, right, and to get to that scale, right? And that's the scale that we think of as what's dominating our culture. But, there's a percolation happening. So, go out and like find those and like buy the books that are doing the utopian work and like, I don't know, write to your local giant movie producer and see if they'll produce it for you. And, these sorts of processes are unfolding. I think that all that said, like there's the dystopia, and then there's like the looking the reality in the face, and like over the last 10 years, like a lot of dystopian shit has happened. The climate's gotten a lot worse. Had a pandemic, that was really dystopian for a lot of people. And so we want like literature to be truth telling and to express our experience and help us understand it, just like we want it to be imaginative and help us see possibilities. So we got to be doing both at the same time. And so I don't find it productive to like stop doing dystopias like finger wagging about that, right? Because we need that.
In 2010 or 2011, Michael Crow asked the same question with Nick Stevenson. It's like, but his point was, you writers just write about dystopias, we need something more positive. We need the science fiction that took us to the moon, right? The crazy, wacky stories that adolescent boys read, and then they went off and did massive things, right? So I think that the challenge comes because people do economics in a lot of the solar punk or the science fiction, but they don't do it in a rigorous way. So there's that rigorous word, I'm sorry. So for example, Becky Chambers has Monk and Robot series, where she's describing essentially a gift economy, which is very, very interesting, except she never talks about ownership. So I'm like, okay, gift economy, you're like, oh, that's a really cool idea. And then you just found her on the rocks of, but what about, and what about, and what about? So just a gesture into a question or make something up or whatever, but there's a more rigor in the writing, helps the imagination as we, just maybe kickstarts people in the deal and think, okay, I can kind of actually see how this would work. Because you come out of reading Monk and Robot and you're like, oh, that's really nice, but that'll never work here, right? So and this is the hardest part about doing any sort of the near future fiction, because you have to explain. This is our friend Alberto Kotika, who runs the Sci-Fi economics lab out of Sweden. His point is the important part is actually talking about how you got there. What was the transition? How did you get from where you were to where you want to be? And it's totally possible. We just need to do it.
I'll put in just from that note while I'm thinking about it, a plug for our next event is going to be our World Building Distinguished Lecture. Nick Fuller-Guggens is coming next month. You have a slide for it, maybe we'll put up in a second. But his new novel, The Great Transition, depicts a transition from a fossil fuel economy to a post-fossil fuel economy in the text, and then shows people living in the future that we make together after that. And I think it's one of the most important climate fiction novels I've read, just because it depicts the change and lets you see it. Because I think that's hard for all of us to imagine, even when we want it. Nick's book is really great. So Thursday, October 24th at 1:30, if you'd like to join us, we'll talk about that too. It sounds like I'm ending. We don't have to end it. We can take a couple more questions. I was going to also add that I think video games are doing a lot of interesting, like utopian cyberpunk kind of stuff, where you live in like a future that's not. I've played a lot of shooting games too, but there's so many games where the only thing you can interact with the world is like by firing at it. And I feel like there's a lot of like futuristic sci-fi now that's about like having a space or solving problems or building things with other people in the game or with other players. And I think that's an interesting space that maybe some things are happening that is harder in narrative for us to imagine. And maybe I keep thinking about the problem with like solar punk sometimes or utopian fiction was always this idea that there won't be any problems in like utopia, which obviously like our solar punk future will also have problems. We need our like romance novels, solar punk romance novels. We're just like a guy can sort of picture hydroponics and he's not wearing a shirt. And we just imagine living there with like really hot people in the future. I think that's going to sell the transition, I think. I'll stop talking about my own narrative needs.
Assignment pro.
We have romantasy now. I want like solar punk romance. I'm ready to go. Eliza, are there any questions from online? Maybe one last question if someone has it. Please, yes.
Yes. So obviously this is more centered around writing rather than like screenwriting or movie or game creation or anything like that. However, one thing I kind of grappled with recently was like the fact that while there has been a lot more analysis of kind of the capitalist structure in mainstream media, like recently. It's also arguably been co-opted by like a lot of like big corporations who will like have these like characters like Hobie Brown and like Spider-Punk, who are clearly anti-establishment, anti-capitalist and stuff like that, but are also being marketed toward like in these massive multi-million-dollar movies. So is there how do we as artists kind of deal with that inherent hypocrisy? Because
Yeah, that's real. I feel that way.
Yeah, with Solarpunk, we're talking about Solarpunk. The best piece of Solarpunk visual media was an ad produced by Chobani, the yogurt
Yes.
company. and we just gotta live with that, because that thing is really good. But it's a yogurt ad. So, you know, I go back and forth on this. But I kind of feel like this is just like that's science with the board, right? Like you just got to play through it. There's not sort of there's not an option to live in a world in which the giant corporations are not going to co-opt our ideas. Or are going to like never try to sort of, inoculate us to anti-establishment rhetoric by including it in like giant franchises and this kind of thing. But I also think like people can still see these characters and figures and be inspired, and like they're the product not just of giant corporations, but also of individual writers and teams and creatives and artists who got one under the door, right? And so we need to sort of remember that all this stuff is contested, and that I don't have an answer. It's just you just feel the headwind, and if Disney came to me and was like, make us a Solarpunk show for us, yeah, I'll do it, because like then it's going to reach more people, right? And maybe some of those are going to be go on and not do anything Solarpunk. They're just going to like purchase more Disney products as a result, right? Buy them merch and such. But some percentage of those people will be moved and entertained and this kind of thing. And of course, like capital is not like unified on these questions all the time, right? Like there's some sections of capital that are really happy to let the world burn, and some that are like a little unsure about that. So that's like you can leverage those conflicts for our interest, I think.
Sounds good.
I can add just maybe one thing to it that I think about for my own work. And some of what I think is the same thing Andrew's talking about, which is like you want access to the culture and you want reach. So some of what you are making some of those choices. My last novel, which was a climate fiction novel, was published by HarperCollins, which is owned by News Corp, Rupert Murdoch, and all, sort of you're taking money from people who are the enemy of the book you wrote in some ways. And I think there was a documentary, it's probably 20 years old, called The Corporation, which is sort of about the history of corporations and idea. And the filmmaker Michael Moore's in it. He's talking about making like Bowling for Columbine and these anti-gun, anti-Walmart kind of movies, but doing it with like Harvey Weinstein's money and stuff like that, And he says in there, like they ask him kind of the same question you just asked, and he says the companies that are paying you to do this just think that they'll make money off it, and they don't think it'll change anything. And I disagree. Like I'll take their money, I'll take their reach, I'll take their distribution, and things will change anyway. And as Andrew was talking, I was thinking like the corporations just want to sell you new widgets, right? And they don't think you'll remember the widgets. They just think you'll buy the next movie, you'll buy the next book, you buy this thing. But we all know that some of the books and movies and art and video games we play and music we consume stick with us forever, and those things do change us. So my hope in some ways is like HarperCollins, hopefully not HarperCollins, but News Corp certainly thinks I'm a widget, maybe, but maybe like some of my widgets will last, and some of those things will have something, some of yours will as well. And so that's sort of the hope, is that that thing you make that is a commodity to them is culture to us, and that culture can do something.
And
Please, I'm so glad not to the last.
And the secret, I mean, the secret, like, edge we've got in that particular struggle is that, like, the good stuff often still rises to the top, right? And like good writing and literature and like art, still matters and succeeds to some extent. And it isn't just reduced to a widget. So, and they don't know why it works that way, but they have no choice but to still try to outcompete each other by platforming the good work.
Yeah. Were you gonna add something on that?
Agreed.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you, Jaffa. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you.